division and apostasy. This is one of the sad lessons of this series in God's redemptive plan. Neither one of those words is something that you want to hear about, but we want to show how God uses that to continue his plan. It's not because of division and apostasy doesn't mean his plan is failing. And we will see that as we go through how God uses division and apostasy in his redemptive plan. Looking back just a little bit, what was the purpose or the purposes of the United Kingdom? And looking back at it, you can say that, well, this is where God fulfilled all but one of the promises to Abraham. Now given them a land, the land that he had promised from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. He's made Abraham a great name by making Israel a great nation. It's united together. It's 12 tribes with their own laws and their own worship, and now they have a temple. And the blessings and the curses that they repeated from Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, that God promised to Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you and I'll curse those who curse you. And they have been a blessing to a lot of people around them, but still not all the nations have been blessed through Abraham. Looking forward, some of the possible purposes of the United Kingdom. Why did we have of approximately 1,000 years of Israel being a nation, an independent status? Only 80 years were they united. When they first came into the land, there were 12 separate tribes that were all scattered about throughout the land, and they all did things, as you remember in the first of Judges, that it said they all did what was right in their own sight, and then they wanted to pick a king, and so they got Saul, and he didn't really unite them and didn't pay attention to what God said, but then David and Solomon come along and put everything united together. And then after that, all the way up until the exile, they were always either at each other's throats or separate in so many different ways. Even after the exile, they came back. They were never really an independent nation ever again. There was a time in between the testaments where they were considered kind of independent during the Maccabees, but there again, it wasn't all 12 tribes back in one place. But I think, and these are just my ideas on why God united a kingdom together, united them together, even though it was a short time. It taught God's people about what it was like to have a king, a united kingdom ruled by one king, 12 different tribes. It taught them about kingship. They really didn't, they had all of their lives been tribal rule. And you can see this in Afghanistan even. That's all still tribal rule. We went over there and tried to democratize the place, and just as soon as we leave, it went right back to tribal rule, because that's 4,000 years of history is hardly a race. Well, it was the same way with Israel. They had hundreds and hundreds of years of history of tribal rule, and that wasn't going away very quickly. Divided, well, yeah, I don't know why I have the divided part there. Anyway, we're still on the united part. To provide a physical lesson on what it was to be a kingdom, to a royal power, what it was to have one person in charge. They had that during the time of the judges. God was supposed to be their king, but they hadn't learned how that worked right, that he was in charge, he's the ruler. Also, it gave a physical type, and Al covered a lot of this in his prototype, anti-type prototypes, a physical type to show that God could establish a kingdom on this earth, but it was a shadow of what his spiritual kingdom was going to be eventually. Also, to provide a place for the temple to be built. A way to pave the way for the final elements, or the final element of God's promise to Abraham, that all nations would be blessed through him. They would all come to Jerusalem. They would all migrate or see that or be attracted to that. That was the physical part of trying to show them then what the spiritual kingdom would be like. And also to begin the refining process. Always God has a refining process in everything that we see. He took Jacob and Esau, he divided them up, and he took Jacob and he sent him off, and he refined him and he matured him in Padan Aram until he was ready for him to come back and continue on. We see that even from the very beginning of the creation. God created light, and then he created the space, and then he came back and he refined each one of those things by adding land to it, by adding trees and bushes, and then animals, and then man. It's a refining process always. Is division always bad or wrong? Everybody agree with that it's not always wrong.
It seems it's wrong for some.
It's wrong in the church.
There are places where it's wrong, but
Yeah, here's the pattern that I saw. Okay, God sent Cain away from Seth. This line was going to continue on. He divided something. At the Tower of Babel, he divided them up by languages and dispersed them throughout the land. God sent Ishmael away from Isaac. But 11 brothers sent Joseph away because they were jealous of him. And 12 tribes failed to separate themselves from the Canaanites, and it cost them dearly. That's how the idolatry got introduced. and one tribe exalts itself above the rest of the family. So it seems like when God does the dividing, it's for good. When man does the dividing, it's usually for the wrong reason. But God uses man's error to try to steer him back to himself. So because man fails, doesn't mean that God's plan has failed. He uses that. His redemptive plan is going to be consistent throughout.
Paul makes a statement in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 when he starts out his discourse about the Lord's Supper. And he says, for first of all, when you come together as church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are proved may be recognized among you. So when people start dividing off and doing whatever they want to do, it points to the, it's like you said, he uses that to try to get man back because the other stands out. Pure.
That's part of the refining process, yep. And we will, I've got that. But, okay. Why did the kingdom divide?
Because of men. Well, actually, God gave it away because it wasn't because of men.
I changed mine and I didn't change this. The divided kingdom. A lot of people will read, and this is especially popular with teaching young people, 1 Kings 12, and say, Rehoboam consulted the elder advisors that his dad had, but he heeded the young men that he grew up around. Note that there was a lack of, in that chapter, there was a lack of ever inquiring about God how I should do this. First his dad's advisors, and then to the young men that he grew up with. It never crossed his mind, apparently, to go to God and say, how do I do this? So he sent his taskmaster to force that was in charge of the forced labor to force them to return. And they killed him. And so then he went back to Jerusalem and he assembled the whole army of Judah and Benjamin. He was going to he thought he was going to reunite them by force again. And that's when God stepped in, sent a prophet, and said, no, you're not going to do that. Don't do that. So he made poor choices in every case. And a lot of people think that that's why the kingdom was divided. But Rehoboam wasn't the reason that the kingdom was divided. The reason that the kingdom was divided is because the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, and he had appeared to him twice and commanded him concerning those things that he shouldn't do. And he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord commanded. Therefore, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. That's why the kingdom divided, is because of what Solomon did. In the next case, in the next verses, it said, yet for the sake of David, I will not do it in your day. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Because of the promise that he made to David about his son sitting on the throne, he wasn't going to tear it out of his hand. He said, I won't tear away all of the kingdom, but I'll give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. So the division was caused by the apostasy of Solomon, but the dividing was done by God. And we have the power as men to choose to divide ourselves. But we don't really choose how the division gets done. That's done by God. When you choose to leave, who goes with you and who stays behind, you don't have any control over that. That's everybody's individual choice in that. But the dividing was done by God. See, he didn't say, well, I'm going to give, or Jeroboam was going to say, I'm going to take 5 tribes for myself and you can have 5. No, the way that God did that was that Jeroboam was going to get 10 and Rehoboam was going to get 1. What happens at the 12th tribe?
They got divided too.
Yeah, which was the 12th tribe that didn't get it? You remember how God came to Jeroboam and told him that he was going to give him the kingdom, that he was going to tear the kingdom away and give part of it to him. And that if Jeroboam would follow in God's ways and God's statutes and God's laws, that he would make sure that Jeroboam had somebody to sit on the throne all the time. So when God tore the kingdom in half, or tore the kingdom apart, and gave the 12 tribes to, or 10 tribes to Jeroboam, he left the Levites intact, scattered throughout Israel, so that Jeroboam could still obey. They still had a way to obey the law because they still had the Levites as the priesthood. Judah still had the Levites as the priesthood. And so the two nations separated, but they could still both choose to follow God. That's not the way that it happened. But you can see why. I was wondering why that's it. Well, what happened to the 12th tribe? The 12th tribe was left intact. The priesthood was left intact and could have been used and could have been followed. Jeroboam set it up his own way. So now we come to apostasy. And that was really the root cause of the division, was the apostasy of Solomon. Apostasy is a Greek word that comes from a standing off. It means a standing off. And some of the synonyms are probably almost more identifiable to apostasy: abandonment. It's kind of like a divorce. Abandonment or disaffection. They lose their affection for God. Dereliction. They quit doing what they're supposed to do. Or estrangement. They forget who He is. And then there's a $10,000 word that I know you've used this probably 3 times last week. Tergiversation. Sorry. that takes more explaining than apostasy does. But interesting synonym. So the next time you hear that in a conversation, you'll go, oh yeah, I know what that means. That's apostasy. Selfishness says, I want it my way. Or, I know how God wants it better than you do. Apostasy is a moving away from God and moving towards self. I am. Instead of God being the I am, I set myself up as I am. I am more righteous than you, in the case of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Or in the case of Israel and Judah, it was I am stronger, or I am smarter. anytime, any of that selfish moving away from God is not what David did to give God the glory. He was always, you are the reason that all of this goodness has been showered on me. Nebuchadnezzar had that same problem too, if you remember later on, is look at what I have done. Instead of giving God the praise and saying, this blessing that's come on me is because you are. Yes,
There's a preacher friend of mine said one time, he says, well, a person was claiming to be I am something, and he says, oh, there's only one I am, and you're not me.
there's only one, yeah.
Larry.
Oh, Larry, I'm sorry. I didn't see your hand, the way it was holding up, it just blended out of
You mentioned apostasy, we always thought maybe that's like you were explaining something to God. Look, God, this is the way I want you to do it, and stuff like that, instead of you praising God and asking him for it, like, God, this is the way I'd like for you to do this or do that. I thought that would be apostasy, but maybe not.
If you say it the way that you said it, it's probably not apostasy. This is the way, because our prayers are like that. This is the way, this is what I would like to happen. I need this help, or this is the way, we want this person to get better.
Yeah.
But more of apostasy would be more like, no, you should do it this way because I know that this is right, and this is the way that you should do it. Right, those are like telling God what he's supposed to do rather than asking God how you would like it. And that's not always bad because we want people to get better, when they're sick. Our prayers go to we need help doing this, or we need strength or faith doing that. And so we ask that, but always your will be done.
Yeah.
Always, God expects us to make plans, but always to be ready for his will to be done and not ours, so that when things don't go our way, we don't blame God. We just say, that you answered that prayer in a different way than I thought, but it's still you that's doing the answering. All right. God uses apostasy and division as a refining tool for his people. They had the choice to divide, but he was going to keep Judah intact, send the rest of them off, keep the priesthood intact if they wanted to follow his rules and his laws in the north. I don't know how that would have worked, whether they would have built a second temple or would have worshipped from one of the high places. But he had the priesthood intact that they could have done things his way. It's always interesting when people divide, that one will say, well, I was right, this shows that I'm right and you're wrong. But in this case, he made it possible for both to still continue to worship him and for both to be right. But man didn't choose, they didn't choose to do that. He was afraid he would lose the kingdom, you remember, so he set up a calf in Bethel and then one in Dan. And they called it Jehovah, but it was an idol. It wasn't God. So if you look at the kind of the refining process, David got Judah. That's where the Messiah was going to come from. He refined it down to one. God left the priesthood intact so Jeroboam could continue to do right. But he always leaves a remnant. You remember what Elijah said? I'm the only one. I'm the only one left in Israel that's worshiping. God said, no, you're not. I still have 7,000 that have not bowed their knee to Baal. Well, how did that work? They didn't have the sacrifices. They didn't have the temple worship. They didn't have the things that were set up in the law. They didn't follow the law. They didn't have a king that God chose. They had something else. So how was it possible for 7,000 people in Israel to still be faithful to God without having all of the stuff that we think that they had to have in order to be right with God?
That's one of those exceptions that God made.
Their relationship with God.
It's my opinion that that's a picture of even the New Testament church as it went into apostasy and went through those dark years and things like that, that God always had a remedy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what did he say when he tore them off the land and sent them to Babylon? Go ahead, Al.
The point you're making, and it's just like when they went to Babylon, you had Daniel and his friends who always prayed to God facing Jerusalem. There were things they were not able to do because of where they were, but they did everything that they could do. And that's that point of that exception. You know, sometimes we make the exception, but only God gets to make the exceptions. And it's just like Samuel being a priest, even though he was of the tribe of Ephraim. He didn't get a choice. It didn't mean other people could be priests. It just meant God appointed him, and that's God. God gets to do that. We don't get to do that. Right? He gets to make those exceptions, and he's going to look at people's situations, just like those 7,000. He's like, they haven't bowed to Baal. They're faithful to me. They may not be able to go to Jerusalem, because by that time they had built much like we have in North and South Korea, border which they guarded not to let Jeroboam, but that it's still to keep people from going to Judah. He was forcefully keeping people because there were people that were leaving and going to Judah. All the Levites ended up leaving and going to Jerusalem. And so the point of what they could do was they did what they could do in service to God. And that's the same thing.
And that's a good lesson for us today to remember.
Ron,
Let's go to the next one.
and it's interesting that Elijah knew nothing about it, obviously. Isn't that interesting?
Didn't know anything about the 7,000.
Yeah,
He didn't know it, so we don't know everything. It's not our game.
yeah. And he didn't know until he needed to know.
Right.
So I have some conclusions that I came to from this lesson, and there's lessons that I think we need to learn in the New Testament church too. But a lot of this comes from what God has done in the past. He's made everything beautiful in its time. He united this kingdom for a reason, and He put eternity into man's heart. Yet, he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Then another one in 1 Corinthians 12 and 25, God has composed a body, giving greater honor to the parts that lack it, that there be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. But then we remember what Al brought up a little earlier, that same thing. There must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. So he knows ahead of time there's going to be divisions. He's going to use those divisions. Another thing we need to remember out of this lesson is that a voice that came to Peter when he was bringing the Gentiles in. He'd been talking about bringing the Gentiles in for a long time. He separated them out, but he was bringing them back when the fullness of time came. What God has made clean, don't call common, or don't call unclean, as some of the translations would say. And then in Ezekiel, when Ezekiel was in exile with the Israelites, why will you die, O house of Israel? I have no pleasure in the death of anyone, declares the Lord God. So turn and live. When there's division, it's not usually, when it happens to us, it's not usually good. But God uses that, and so we need to, when it happens, we need to go to God, find out where we need to change, how we need to change, and follow his path. Because you don't want to be on the wrong side of that division. Just because of various reasons. You know, my family went that way, so I'm gonna follow my family. My grandpa believed that, so I'm gonna follow what my grandpa said. It does seem to contradict what God says, but I don't want my grandpa to be lost or something like that. We've got to follow God.
He does not desire that there be divisions among us,
Right.
but he desires for all of us to be aimed toward heaven and working together to try to help each other get there. And it's not necessarily the best thing for us to decide to divide. Our decision should be to try to join together and help each other understand and work toward God. Not necessarily say, well, that person is an idiot, don't listen to him. We should be trying to teach in a constructive, loving way rather than dividing.
I agree.
And he does use it to separate. You're right. God does use it. But our goal should be to serve God in the way he wants us to be.
We're trying to, as it says in Ephesians chapter 4, maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace.
But you have to lay over all of that, the fact that the devil is trying to divide.
You can't forget.
There's always that.
Now, and on Teresa's point, 1 Corinthians is written as a point of trying to point out the things that are going wrong and that they need to come together. And the first thing Paul does in verse 10 of chapter 1 is that you be of the same mind and the same judgment. He's pointing this out. This is where I'm trying to bring you. And I'm pointing out things to you to get you back to this point. There's the other part of it is when he makes that statement in chapter 11 that those genuine among you be recognized. There's that thing there that he's pointing. When you look back at the Tower of Babel, at that point of that division, all people gravitated toward those who could speak the same language so they could understand each other. That tends to be what happens when you start having divisions. People who have the same way of thinking want to gravitate toward one another. And what you're left with is those who are trying to follow the Lord. And when you can see that, even those divisions can sit there and go, well, wait a minute. Aren't we supposed to be following the Lord? Shouldn't we be doing holy toward the Lord?
I've got one more slide, and I hesitate to bring this slide up because part of this discussion, a lot of times the discussion that we have among us can't be heard over the part that we're streaming. And so you got to always remember the other audience out there and that we have other people that are listening. And so things can get misunderstood if you don't hear all of the conversation or all of discussion that's going on. But these are questions that I have that make for good discussion and really something to think about, especially in light of our history as a New Testament church. The one statement that I do make is that there is only one united kingdom. There's only one king, and that's Jesus. The body of the saved doesn't meet in one place like they did in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem now, where all the saved are gathered, or all the saved are listed, all the saved are been translated into the kingdom of Christ. Does the name above the door matter to God?
There's only one name under heaven which man can be saved. Does the name matter?
Does your name on a membership roll on earth matter to God? And where are the members of the United Kingdom, which is the universal church? Where is that membership list? What is that membership list?
The book of life.
The Lamb's Book of Life. That's exactly right. And we don't have it in the office back there.
You have a bigger relationship with God. And what you mean to Him.
So I always want to remember when I'm talking to other people that God said to Ezekiel, I still have 7,000 that have not bowed their knee to Baal, even though you don't know who they are. And you can't understand how it could be possible for them to be right with me, but not be worshiping in Jerusalem. So there's always those things that are God's end of the stick to whittle on and not ours that we need to keep in mind. But at the same time, what Al was saying, you gather with people of like precious faith. We have a tendency to gather together with people that think the way that we think. But that doesn't always mean that we're right because of that, and that somebody else among us that doesn't think just exactly like that is necessarily wrong. We're not going to have all the right answers. And that's why we gather together as one, because then we can feed off of each other and build each other up and listen to what each other has. Yes?
The basic problem is teaching for doctrine and commandments of men. If you get rid of that, you're in good shape.
That's exactly right. And that happens in a lot of places. But we have to always look at that ourselves. The Restoration Church didn't just happen in one time back in history. The Restoration Church happens every single Sunday, every single day. We need to be restoring our faith. I'm sorry.
That He said, I didn't hear what He said.
Where you get into the problem is when the doctrines of men you teach as the commandments of God. And that's what Jesus told them. You're teaching things like that was God that was said them, and He didn't. You said them, but you're teaching the commandments of men, and you're overriding God's commandments. Don't.
Two points. It's man's responsibility to obey God's word
Yes.
to the absolute best of his ability, as he understands it.
Yes.
And God would judge us correctly and justly and have mercy.
Amen. That's exactly right.
unity, in the church and whatever, does not mean that we think everything alike. We're united in spirit and so on, but like you said, we may miss some things. And, it doesn't mean we have everything right. If we have just an absolute, I don't know, thinking everything right.
Right, and it's the unity of the Spirit, not all, we don't all have the same talents, we don't all have the same education, we don't all have the same economic status. Those are the things that man looks at. But once we're united under Christ, then those things become building blocks for each of us, you know.
Ray, I preached a sermon here one time, and I wished I'd had a tape of that, but he preached about, I believe it's in the book of Numbers, if I may be wrong, Joey or Don can probably straighten me out on it. But he had things that was important to be put in that Bible, and it don't tell you anything about those people at all, what they done during the Bible, but it was important to God to put all these names in this Bible, because he felt of importance to those people, and their names in the Bible, but you don't never read anything about them or what they done. And I thought that was a wonderful sermon, you know, because God has got them pictured up. They must be in the Lamb Book of Life, because he wanted them in the whole Bible there. I thought that was a wonderful sermon. You don't know what they done, how important it was, how they served God, but God said it was important these names we put in the Bible.
And James said something too, that, you know, about when he was talking about our mouth and our tongue. And he said, you know, with it we use it to bless God and curse men who were created in the image of God. Everybody out there is God's creation.
Yeah.
So we need to remember that when I need to, I'm sorry, I need to remember that when I open my mouth.
Yeah.
Bill.
There are a lot of people much braver than I am who look at the Bible and figure different ways of context or different implications. I want at least one thing. When I'm in judgment, I want Christ to at least be able to say to God, he did exactly what you said as best he could.
Best
Best he could, and the point that, the thing that, like Bill brought up earlier about doctrines, teaching as doctrine, the commandments of men, that unity that we're talking about, God expects the doctrine to be unified. Like Paul brought up, we may have different thoughts on opinion or reach different conclusions.
Yeah.
But that doctrine all has to be the same. Because that's God's doctrine. And if God chooses to save somebody over exception of that doctrine, that's God, but it's going to come down to that best ability. Were they really trying to find out God's will? That's what it's going to come down to. And that's where God's just and righteous. And I've always said God's going to save everyone he can. He can.
These issues that are raised when we have different opinions maybe about something, trying to understand it, because each of us bring to the table a little different grasp of the thing. These are also opportunities for all of us to practice our Christianity, love and humility, and working together.
Yes, they are. Amen. Amen. Thank you very much. Next week, we will discuss them leaving, getting jerked off the land and being in exile.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's mine, man.
Thank you. Citizen of the decade, huh?